Thank you and good morning. As Alice said, I used to work at the Treasury, which was where I first came across him. We were reminiscing earlier about the fact that he had come in to lobby the Treasury Minister on what were then the CSER standards on alternative trading systems, which he was trying to persuade us were the work of the devil, or phasey, as I think he called him. So it's particularly pleasing to see Alistair sitting on a panel with Brendan. What I'm going to do is talk about the process, what we think of the implementation challenges, and then a little bit about some of the topics in MiFID. The first thing I should probably talk about is the timetable. Obviously, the date of application as set out in the legislation is the 3rd of January 2017. We had a statement from the Commission on Tuesday at the European Parliament hearing on MiFID. We are in effect in the same position as you in relation to what the Commission said on Tuesday. It's interesting, it's significant, but at the moment there is no proposal for a change to the deadline. We have to wait and see how exactly the Commission follows up on its statement from Tuesday and what form of proposal comes forward, whether it's going to make a proposal for a delay to the entire piece of legislation or whether it's only going to propose that some elements of the legislation are delayed. I think the key thing, certainly from our point of view, is that we are continuing with our preparations to be ready for the 3rd of January 2017 at the moment. That's the only sensible basis, I think, on which we can plan. And I think even if the timetable were to go out by a year, as the Commission was suggesting, it's still important, given the challenge which MiFID II presents, for firms to be continuing to work hard on their implementation. The other thing that was being discussed on Tuesday was the implementing measures for MiFID, particularly the technical standards. We are expecting still the Commission to adopt the delegated acts in the next month or two. Whilst those are mainly focused on conduct issues, they obviously have some important components which are relevant to markets, definitions of high-frequency trading, definitions of systematic internalizer, and the proposals around investment research and inducements. Again, we're in the same position you of waiting to see exactly where the Commission has got to. We were involved in the discussions that the Commission was having with the Council, but those stopped back in May. I assume that the Commission has been doing some tidying up and making some changes since May, but we don't know exactly what those changes are, and we'll have to wait and see when they publish them and adopt them, where exactly they are coming out. In terms of the technical standards, obviously ESMA has delivered its drafts of the bulk of the technical standards at the end of September. There is the potential in the process for the technical standards for the European Commission to send back technical standards to ESMA if it thinks they need changing. We are not sure whether that is going to happen, but again, obviously we've been observing the public debate which has been going on the standards, and including reflected in the hearing on Tuesday. It would appear that most of the focus of the debate is around non-equity transparency, particularly in relation to the definition of liquidity for bond markets, commodities issues, the ancillary exemption and position limits, and to a certain extent on best execution and the standards on execution quality. Some people have been making points about others of the standards, but I would assume that that's where the Commission is focusing on at the moment, and we'll have to see whether then they send any of the standards back to ESMA. If they do, that's a period which takes 6 weeks for ESMA to consider the points being made by the Commission. I presume once ESMA responds, the Commission will then have to consider ESMA's response, and that means that potentially, if the Commission goes down that route, it's going to be well into next year or into the early part of next year before the technical standards are adopted and then go for scrutiny by the Council and the Parliament. And if there are any changes, then that scrutiny period goes out from 1 month to 3 months. There is also level 3 work going on. The Commission is going to be talking to the Member States about the interpretation of the legislation as part of their preparations for implementation on the 3rd of December. There were some initial discussions around it, interpretation issues earlier in the year, in January and February. Member States have been submitting a series of questions. We haven't seen the sets of questions which Member States have been submitting yet, but the last meeting was postponed because of the weight of questions which apparently had been submitted by Member States. Possibly the most important issue that was previously discussed, but where the Commission hadn't expressed an opinion, was around direct electronic access and whether the restrictions on the exemption in Article 2.1d, whereby if you're dealing on own account and you have DEA access to EU markets, you have to be authorised, applies to people outside of the EU. That question was raised with the Commission. They have not yet provided an answer, but they may provide an answer, I assume, at the workshop on the 3rd of December. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what they say on that and what other issues are raised by Member States in terms of the interpretation of the legislation. With the bulk of the technical standards out of the way, ESMA is now focusing on its work on Level 3 interpretation of the legislation, which will be a mixture, I would assume, of guidelines and questions and answers in the same way as there's been on other pieces of legislation. By and large, I suspect most of that material will not be published until the processes of approval for the technical standards have been completed. So into the course of next year and probably sometime in the second quarter of next year. Some material may come out before that. ESMA is currently discussing that, but we'll have to wait and see and provide more information on that as we know a little bit more about the discussions. But work is going on transaction reporting, work is going on secondary markets issues. People are thinking about issues in commodities, and work is going on and is more advanced in relation to investor protection issues. And that includes best execution, where ESMA is looking at the question and answers which were provided back in 2007 in relation to the best execution obligations and working out what it needs to do in terms of updating that material. Moving on to what we're doing domestically in terms of implementation. Implementation requires consultation from Treasury, FCA and PRA. Treasury consulted in March of this year. We are planning to produce a consultation paper in December of this year. That consultation paper will be relatively limited because of the ongoing uncertainty about the implementing measures. It is mainly going to focus on a small number of markets-related issues, the implementation of the requirements on regulated markets, MTFs and OTFs. There will be potentially some updates to the perimeter guidance on certain issues, including possibly saying something about what we regard as being a multilateral system. The bulk of our consultation on implementation will come next year. We've yet finally to decide on the timing of that, and it's partly conditional on where the European process gets to in terms of the implementing measures. I think in terms of our implementation, you should not expect a huge number of surprises in terms of the handbook changes we are actually going to be making. A lot of MiFID is in directly applicable regulations. Therefore, by and large, in the handbook, we will be signalling that a directly applicable regulation exists rather than copying it out. And we will be providing probably limited guidance on those directly applicable regulations. We will be looking in the first instance to ESMA to provide guidance on directly applicable regulations. There may be some instances where we do provide guidance, but those I suspect are going to be relatively limited. Probably the sort of perimeter issues, definitions of financial instruments through the perimeter guidance manual will be the main areas where we provide additional guidance in terms of the interpretation of the legislation. The PRA also has to consult, will be consulting, I think, next year, probably around the time of our second consultation paper. Obviously, we're also going to be communicating with firms. We had our wholesale MiFID conference. Following that up, we'll be having briefings on specific topics, transaction reporting, best execution, etc. We're still working out exactly the timing of those sessions and how exactly we will organise them. We have been discussing, we have regular meetings with around 20-odd trade associations who have an interest in MiFID II, from AFME to the National Farmers Union. In those discussions, we've been talking about the ways in which we communicate with firms, and they have expressed significant preference for having material put on our website, which can be then disseminated fairly widely. So we're looking at that. Clearly, with the conference, we put up the videos of the various sessions. It might be that if we run sessions where we are talking about particular topics, we will film some of those and again put them up on the website so that a wider group of people than were able to attend the session are able to see them. Moving on to the implementation challenges, I think there's several points I'd make here. Firstly, that the legislation itself creates an implementation challenge because of the fact that, by and large, it does not have in it any transitional provisions. We move almost automatically from a world of MiFID I to a world of MiFID II. There are various areas where that is clearly problematic and challenging. It's obviously been pointed out in relation to the double volume caps, that you have to collect information from a world in which the waivers are going to be different from those which apply in MiFID II. There are issues around authorization for specialist commodity derivatives firms and various of those sorts of things. We will attempt to be pragmatic, and I think ESMA will have to consider some of these issues in terms of its level 3 work, but fundamentally we are constrained by, as I say, the fact that by and large the legislation doesn't do transitional provisions. Secondly, obviously MiFID is a significant change in the structure of markets. People are going to have to think carefully about how they position their business. We're moving from a world in which we're moving towards a world in which there is a greater scope of activity which is going to be covered by venue-type provisions, whether it's the organised trading facility, whether it's going to be systematic internalisers, where people are going to have to think carefully about how they get their client business done and what is the right structure for them. I think it has often been pointed out to us that a lot of the provisions potentially favour people with scale, simply because of their complexity. But people who have not got scale are going to clearly have to work out what exactly is their niche in terms of the provisions and how they organise their business post-MiFID II. I think in those terms it is more of a dramatic change than we had with the original directive. Clearly there's also going to have to be a compliance effort to make sure that people come into compliance with the various new laws and regulations that MiFID II brings. Clearly in doing that, we would stress to people that it's not just about complying with the letter of the law. They have to think about their obligations to their clients and their obligations to the wider marketplace. Those are the two key prisms through which I think people need to think about their compliance efforts. We have said that eventually we will set out a list of supervisory priorities of the key things that we care about in terms of looking at the way in which the directive has been implemented, and which will be the things which we prioritise when we come to look at how people have implemented post the implementation date. We haven't yet got down to writing those down on paper, but I think from our existing work it's fairly easy to conclude the sorts of things that we'll be interested in. Transaction reporting is going to have a high priority for us because of the links into market abuse and the revisions to the market abuse legislation. Issues like best execution, investment research, and looking at how the changes to market structure have been bedded down, whether people have correctly ascribed their activity to the right sides of the various boundaries which exist within the market structure provisions of MiFID II. Now I want to turn on to some of the issues in the legislation. Investment research is one of the issues which is covered by the delegated acts, where we're still waiting for the Commission to adopt those, so we don't know the final form of the legislation. Clearly, there has been a lot of lobbying about the investment research provisions, focused on, I think, two things: the payment mechanism and the extent to which execution commissions can still be used to pay for research, and the coverage of research in fixed income and commodity markets. Leaving those issues aside, I think there is still going to be, wherever the Commission comes out on those issues, significant change as a result of the MiFID II with investment research, which is going in the direction of some of the changes that we have been trying to introduce in the UK, better governance of the way in which the buy side pays for its research, budgeting and the pricing of research. I think no matter what the fine detail of the payment mechanism, all of those elements will make their way into the final legislation. Best execution. I think in terms of the way the best execution rules work, there is not going to be a fundamental change between MiFID I and MiFID II. The sorts of issues which are issues under the current best execution rules, particularly how do they apply to more illiquid and more bespoke instruments, will continue to be issues in the MiFID II world. And the sorts of issues that we were raising in our thematic review about the governance of best execution and the way in which people monitor their best execution, again, are going to continue to be key concerns for us post-MiFID II as they are under the existing rules. The main innovation, I think, in best execution is the provisions dealing with execution quality applying to venues and to brokers and investment managers. One of the key questions we've been asked about that is the extent to which it is going to be compulsory to use the information that is generated by those provisions. In our view, it is not compulsory to use that information. You may look and consider whether that is going to be useful for your best execution monitoring, but if you have alternative sources of information which are more bespoke, more tailored to your specific needs, it is perfectly legitimate to continue using those sources of information. We will have to wait and see exactly how data vendors and others use the information which is generated and whether there are products which they create off the back of that information which are going to be useful to you, but it is not obligatory to use that information. Turning to equity markets, clearly there is less of a focus in MiFID II on equity markets than there is on non-equity markets because there were a set of changes made in the original legislation in this area. However, there are still important changes which are happening which are going to affect equity markets. The transparency regime, or the post-trade transparency regime, is changing with shorter delays for post-trade transparency for block trades. By and large, that is based on observed behaviour and the way in which the delays under the existing legislation have been used, and also the general effort in MiFID II to increase the amount of transparency in the legislation. I think we'll have to wait and see how exactly that works out, particularly where people are wanting to move particularly large blocks of trades, but also how it applies in the trading of illiquid shares. There are slightly longer delays which are available for the most illiquid shares, but they are still significantly shorter than are available under the existing legislation. So I think there's a question there about how that will actually work out in practice. The double volume cap, I think, following a remark by my director, David Lawton, at a conference at the FCA, we are officially allowed to call the double volume cap clunky. Marcus Ferber last week, the rapporteur of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in the Parliament on MiFID, said, don't worry about the double volume cap. There is a review clause in the legislation so that if it significantly disrupts the way in which the market functions, then it can be dealt with in due course. Unfortunately, that review clause doesn't kick in until a little while after the legislation has taken effect. Inevitably, it will take people time to gather evidence, and then you have, if people want to make changes, the problem with the double volume cap is that it is in level 1 and not in level 2. All we have effectively in level 2 are provisions relating to the data gathering, not substantively to the way in which the double volume cap works. Therefore, I don't think anyone should be under any illusion that the double volume cap is simply going to disappear relatively quickly after MiFID II comes into effect. It will be there for some point, for some significant amount of time, even if people perceive after MiFID II comes into effect that it is clunky and it's not achieving its desired aim. I think, therefore, in the UK terms, clearly there is more dark trading going on in the UK than probably in other jurisdictions, and it's going to have a bigger effect on the trading of UK shares than the trading of shares in other jurisdictions, and much further beyond simply the most liquid shares, the significant amounts of dark trading in some of the less liquid shares. We will obviously have to see how this works out in practice and how disruptive this is to the market and what happens with the 6-month suspensions. But as I say, I think that is going to come into effect and it will be there for some significant point in time. Systematic internalisers in equity markets. I think the main issue where there is a degree of uncertainty is what constitutes justified price improvement. What I would say is that the European Commission is previously on record, and this was in relation actually to retail service providers, are saying that where people are offering price improvement, it mustn't be to such a scale that it denudes the prices which they are actually quoting of significant information value. Therefore, if you are consistently price improving such that you are not consistently trading at the quotes which you publicly provide, that is likely to fall foul of the provisions on systematic internalisers. The circumstances in which you are likely to be able to price improve, I suspect, will be expected to be relatively limited. It's not expected to be a central feature of the way in which the equity systematic internaliser regime works. Turning on to non-equity markets, obviously there is an ongoing debate about the transparency provisions, particularly focused on bond markets, as I mentioned earlier. We don't know where that is going to come out. As the regulators, we're waiting to see whether or not the Commission sends back the relevant technical standard or not. But clearly, there have been noises made, both at the Council level and by some parliamentarians on that issue. In terms of the systematic internaliser regime in the non-equities market, is obviously, in contrast to that for the equities market, is not a continuous quoting obligation. The key uncertainty there is the extent to which you have to continue to be hit by a price when you've decided to quote. I think it is significant that there is a provision in the non-equities SI regime for people to update those quotes. And I think this is something that ESMA is going to have to think about in terms of level 3 guidance and how that quoting obligation works, when you can update, how quickly you can update any quote that you've provided to the market. Organised trading facilities, clearly the key distinction between them and the MTF is discretion. People are going to, when trying to become an OTF, clearly explain how discretion is going to be used in their system. And it's going to have to be clear that what they are doing is distinct from what is being done in the MTF category. This poses a challenge given that people have hybrid business models which involve elements of electronic trading, elements of voice trading. We'll have to see how that works out in practice, but as I say, I think there is going to have to be a proper distinction between MTF and OTF. That, I think, is important because of my final point, which is about the access of commercial firms to trading venues. The way in which the exemptions work in MiFID, if anyone has direct electronic access to a trading venue or is a member of a regulated market or an MTF, they have to be authorised. That poses challenges for commercial firms potentially accessing commodity. There is an exemption for commodity derivatives, but where people are trading foreign exchange, that may be a challenge, and we'll have to see how people structure their businesses to deal with that challenge. Clearly, there are some platforms, I think, which would naturally fall into the MTF category, which are trading foreign exchange. They may be wanting to look at becoming an OTF to ensure that commercial clients can continue to directly access the platform without being authorised, but they would need to change their systems in order to ensure that they are properly within the OTF category. Finally, commodities. Again, on Tuesday, you will have seen there was a lot of noise from the parliamentarians about position limits. Marcus Ferber saying that ESMA has done a poor job. It's simultaneously too tough and too lax on position limits, and lots of complaints from the Greens, the Communists and the Socialists that ESMA is in effect too lax and is in the pocket of the industry. I would expect, therefore, there is a significant possibility that there might be change in the position limits regime, but we'll have to see exactly what the details of that are. On the ancillary exemption, which is about commercial firms and the extent to which they can be exempt from the legislation, again, people are raising concerns about that and saying that ESMA has not included a capital test, that the thresholds that ESMA has chosen are too low. Again, we'll have to wait and see how that develops. But again, that's an area of focus and one where there's going to be a significant challenge for us as regulators to be pragmatic because of the way in which the thresholds operate. If somebody fails a threshold, obviously they cannot become instantly regulated because another piece of the legislation says that a regulator has 6 months to review any application for authorization, and it would clearly be rather bizarre if somebody was told they had to halt business for that 6-month period, or actually the 9-month period once they put together their application and then it's reviewed by the regulator. So I think there are some practical challenges which we need to think about and which ESMA needs to think about in relation to the ancillary exemption.